The world is shrinking to the four walls of this shack. Alara lies on the thin mattress, a collection of straw and threadbare blankets, and feels the life inside her stir. It is a faint flutter, a promise that feels more like a memory. Outside, the wind is a whetted knife against the chinked logs, promising a cold that will seep through the cracks and steal what little warmth she has left. She is pregnant, alone, and fading. The last of the salted pork is gone. The flour sack is a dusty ghost. Soon, the only thing left will be the icy water from the creek and the gnawing emptiness in her belly. Her husband, Thomas, is a phantom now, his handsome face and easy promises dissolved into the vast, unforgiving plains. He went for supplies 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks of dawns breaking over an empty horizon. 6 weeks of dusks settling into a lonely, terrifying dark. At first, she made excuses, a delay in the town of redemption, a lame horse, and early snow in the pass. Now she knows. The excuses are just another form of starvation. He is not coming back. A sharp pain, low in her belly, makes her gasp. It is not the baby. It is the hunger, a predator curling inside her. She presses a hand to her swollen stomach, a gesture both protective and desperate. Just a little longer, she whispers, her voice a dry rasp. I'll keep you safe. I promise, but the promise feels as hollow as the shack. She is a flickering candle flame, and the wind outside is growing stronger. A shadow falls across the single, grimy window pane, large and sudden. It is not the shape of a cloud. It is the shape of a man. Terror, cold and sharp, lances through her, a stark contrast to the dull ache of her hunger. She has nothing to steal but the last breath in her body. The heavy wooden door creaks open. There's more to this man than meets the eye. Before his true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. He stands silhouetted against the bruised purple of the twilight sky, a giant framed in the doorway, blocking the wind and bringing the chill in with him. He is a man made of harsh lines and exhaustion, his face obscured by a low-brimmed hat and a week's worth of stubble dark as soot. One hand is pressed against his side, and even in the dim light, she could see the dark stains spreading across his duster. He was hurt. The thought registered with a strange, detached clarity. He took one step inside, then another, his boots heavy on the packed dirt floor. He surveyed the pathetic interior of the shack, the empty hearth, the overturned crate that served as a table, and finally, her, a heap of blankets and fear on the cot. His gaze lingered on the unmistakable swell of her belly. A muscle jumped in his jaw, and with 3 words that sounded like rocks grinding together, I mean no harm, his life, and hers, were irrevocably changed. He had collapsed just inside the door, his strength giving out in a rush. Alara had remained frozen for a long minute, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He was an outlaw. She saw it in the worn holster at his hip, the hard-set weariness in his face that spoke of long nights staring into the dark. But he was also bleeding, and the storm he'd outrun was now unleashing its fury, sleet ticking against the roof like angry claws. Leaving him to die on her floor felt like a sin she couldn't afford, not when she was praying for a miracle of her own. Hesitantly, she had pushed herself up, her head swimming from the effort. She'd lit the last of her candles, the small flame throwing dancing, monstrous shadows across the room. The man's face, in the flickering light, was younger than she'd first thought, etched with pain but not cruelty. His breathing was shallow. She found the wound in his side, a ragged tear from a bullet that had grazed him, deep and angry. Her medical knowledge was limited to what her mother had taught her about farm accidents and childhood fevers, but it was more than nothing. With trembling hands, she'd torn a strip from one of her last clean petticoats, boiled water from her dwindling supply over a tiny fire she coaxed from twigs, and cleaned the wound as best she could. He'd flinched and groaned, but never opened his eyes. She'd packed it with the last of some dried yarrow she'd gathered in late summer and bound it tightly. The act was intimate, terrifying. Her hands, brushing his skin, felt the heat of his fever. When she was done, she dragged a spare blanket over him and retreated to her cot, watching him, waiting for him to wake or to die. He woke near dawn. The storm had settled into a steady, howling gale. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, finding her in the gloom. He looked at the clean bandage at his side, then back at her. "Obliged," he said. The single word was rough and used. Alara just nodded, pulling her own thin blanket tighter. "Who are you?" He considered the question for a long moment. "Man who needed a roof," he finally answered, deflecting. "Name's Silas." He didn't offer more, and she didn't ask. An outlaw's name was likely a lie anyway. She told him hers was Alara. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken questions. He saw her condition, the barrenness of the shack. His gaze was sharp, missing nothing. "Your man?" he asked, his eyes flicking toward the door. "Gone for supplies," she said, the lie tasting like ash. It was a matter of pride, a flimsy shield against the pity she saw dawning in his eyes. Silas didn't press. He understood the sort of truths people told in the wilderness. He swung his legs over the side of the floor where he lay and tried to stand, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his lips. He sank back down, his face pale. "Posse was on me south of the Cimarron," he stated, not as an apology, but as a fact. "Lost them in the foothills when the weather turned. Figured I'd find an old line shack to hole up in." He looked around again. "This ain't it." "Homestead," Alara clarified quietly. "My husband. We were building a life." The words sounded foolish now. For 2 days, they existed in that tense, confined space. The storm raged, locking them in a world of wind and wood and silence. Silas's fever rose, and he drifted in and out of a restless sleep. In his delirium, he muttered names: a woman, Mary; a place, Black Creek; fragments of a life she couldn't piece together. She used her own water to cool his head, sharing the last of her resources with a dangerous stranger. It was a gamble. If he died, she was alone. If he lived, what then? On the 3rd day, the fever broke. The storm broke with it. A weak, watery sunlight filtered through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Silas sat up, his movements slow but deliberate. He looked at her, his gaze clear for the first time. He saw the hollows under her eyes, the translucent quality of her skin. He saw she was starving. Without a word, he pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the pull at his side. He took his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice still rough but carrying a new note of command. He shrugged on his heavy duster, the movement stiff, and walked out into the blinding white of the new snow. Alara watched him go from the window, a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. He could just keep walking. He owed her nothing. The bandage was a fair trade for the shelter. She waited, listening to the drip of melting snow from the eaves, the minutes stretching into an hour. The silence of the landscape was absolute. Just as despair began to creep back in, she saw him returning, a dark figure moving steadily against the snow. He carried 2 rabbits, limp and dark against the white. He didn't say a word as he came back inside. He skinned and cleaned them with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing, his hands sure and practiced. Soon, the shack was filled with the impossibly rich scent of roasting meat. He handed her the first piece, cooked through and tender. The first bite was agony and ecstasy. Her body, so long deprived, seized on it. Tears streamed down her face, silent and unstoppable. She ate with a desperate, primal need, not caring how she looked. Silas turned away, giving her the privacy of her shame and her relief. He ate his own portion slowly, his eyes on the fire, but she knew he was aware of every shuddering breath she took. When she was finished, she felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire. It was life. It was hope. She looked at the stranger across the small room, this outlaw who had brought food back to a shack he had every reason to abandon. "Thank you," she whispered. Silas merely grunted, but he didn't look away. "Need to keep your strength up," he said, his gaze dropping to her stomach. "For the baby." It was the first time either of them had acknowledged the child so directly. In that moment, the baby wasn't just her burden. It was a fact of their shared existence in this shack. His act of providing for her was a choice, a step away from being a mere fugitive and toward being a protector. He could have left her to her fate, the one her own husband had condemned her to. But he had stayed. He had hunted. And in the simple act of sharing a meal, a fragile, unspoken pact was forged between them in the heart of the desolate wilderness. The outlaw was no longer just a threat. He was her only chance. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. The deep snow kept them isolated, a world unto themselves. Silas, despite the lingering pain in his side, became a whirlwind of quiet industry. He used Thomas's abandoned axe to chop a mountain of firewood, the steady thump-thump-thump a reassuring heartbeat in the frozen silence. He found the weak spots in the roof where the wind had peeled back the sod and patched them with pine boughs and mud, his work methodical and sure. He reinforced the door and chinked the walls, his efforts slowly transforming the drafty shack from a sieve into a sanctuary. Alara, her strength slowly returning with regular food, took over the domestic tasks. She cooked the game he brought in. More rabbits, a tough old grouse, stretching every morsel, making stews that simmered for hours over the fire, filling the small space with a scent of home she thought she'd forgotten. She mended the tear in his duster with careful, tiny stitches, her needle dipping in and out of the heavy fabric. Her own clothes were worn, but she found a spare shirt of Thomas's and began cutting it down, refashioning it into swaddling clothes for the baby. They rarely spoke, but their silence was no longer tense. It was a language of shared tasks and mutual reliance. She would watch his hands as he sharpened his knife, marveling at the contrast between their calloused roughness and the gentleness with which he handled delicate tasks, like resetting a snare. He, in turn, would watch her as she sat by the fire, her face softened by the light, her hands moving with a graceful purpose as she sewed. He saw the fierce determination in the set of her jaw, the unwavering resolve of a mother protecting her young. One evening, while he was cleaning his rifle, she spoke into the quiet. My husband's name was Thomas. Silas didn't look up, but his hands stilled. He was listening. He was a good talker, she continued, her voice soft. He could talk the birds from the trees. Talked me into leaving my family in Ohio, into believing in this. She gestured vaguely at the log walls. He painted pictures with words. A ranch with 1,000 head of cattle, a White House with a porch. This was just the start, he said. A temporary stop. She gave a small, bitter laugh. I think the silence out here was too much for him. There was nothing to fill it but the truth. Silas finally looked at her, his gray eyes holding hers. The truth being? That it's hard, she said simply. That a picture in your head doesn't stop the winter from coming. He wasn't built for the hard parts. Silas nodded slowly, a deep understanding in his gaze. He knew about men who weren't built for the hard parts. He'd known them his whole life. Some men ain't, he agreed. He went back to oiling his rifle, but the air had changed. She had offered him a piece of her past, a truth she'd been hiding even from herself. A few days later, it was his turn. She was kneading a pitiful lump of dough made from the last of her flour and some ground nuts Silas had found. Her back ached, and she paused, pressing a hand to the small of it with a sigh. My wife, Mary, he said, his voice so low she almost missed it. She died of a fever. We had a small plot of land down by Black Creek. Not much, but it was ours. He stared into the fire, his face a mask of old grief. Land baron named Abernathy wanted the water rights. Tried to buy us out for pennies. When I refused, he dammed the creek upstream. Our crop withered. Mary, she got sick. The doctor from town wouldn't come for what little we could pay. He fell silent, the muscle in his jaw working. After I buried her, I went to Abernathy's office. I didn't go for the money he kept in his safe. I went for the water deed he'd forged. I took it, and I took the money he'd cheated us out of. No more, no less. He finally looked at her, his eyes burning with a cold fire. He called it robbery. I called it justice. The law sided with him. Now she understood. He wasn't a common thief. He was a man who had lost everything and tried to take a piece of it back. He was an outlaw, but he was not a villain. He was a man shaped by injustice, just as she had been shaped by abandonment. This new knowledge settled between them, a bond forged in shared loss. She was no longer just a pregnant woman he'd stumbled upon, and he was no longer just a dangerous fugitive. They were two people clinging to a precipice, who had found a handhold in each other. The outside world intruded a week later. A figure on horseback appeared on the ridge, a distant speck against the sky. Silas saw him first. He moved with a sudden, silent urgency, grabbing his rifle and pulling Alara away from the window. Get down, he hissed. Her heart leaped into her throat. They crouched on the floor, listening. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, slow and deliberate, crunching in the snow. They stopped right outside the shack. Alara held her breath, her hand flying to her stomach. The baby chose that moment to kick, a hard, insistent thump. A voice called out, rough and impatient. "Hello, the shack. Anyone in there?" Silas's body was coiled like a spring beside her, his knuckles white on his rifle. He was ready to fight. Ready to die? "It's a bounty hunter," he whispered, his voice grim. "Jedediah Kane. He's been tracking me for months." Alara's mind raced. If she stayed silent, Kane might assume the shack was deserted and move on. Or he might get suspicious and break down the door. If he found Silas, there would be a gunfight. In this tiny space, she and her baby would be caught in the middle. But if she answered, another call, louder this time. "I know someone's in there. Saw the smoke from your chimney." She had to make a choice. Protect herself by staying silent and hope for the best, or protect Silas and risk everything. She looked at his face, saw the grim acceptance there, the look of a man who expected to die fighting. She thought of the roasted rabbit, the patched roof, the firewood stacked neatly by the door. She thought of the way he looked at the fire when he spoke of his dead wife. Before Silas could stop her, she pushed herself to her feet. He grabbed for her arm, his eyes wide with alarm. "What are you doing?" "Trust me," she whispered. She took a deep, shaky breath and walked to the door. Her hand trembled as she lifted the latch. She opened it just a crack, peering out. The man outside was burly and bearded, with small, piggy eyes that appraised her instantly, taking in her swollen form and the poverty of her clothes. A sneer touched his lips. "Well now, what we got here?" he grunted. "Looking for a man. Tall, dark hair. Answers to Silas." "Seen him?" Alara summoned every ounce of strength she had, forcing her voice to be steady, if a little weak. "No, sir. No one's been by here. Just me." Kane's eyes narrowed, scanning the shack behind her. "You all alone out here, ma'am? In your condition?" "My husband is away," she said, the lie coming more easily this time. "He's due back any day." The bounty hunter grunted, unconvinced. His gaze swept the snowy ground around the shack. Silas was a careful man, but one mistake, one track not properly covered, could be his undoing. "Funny," Kane said, stroking his greasy beard. "Found tracks leading this way. 2 horses. One of them shod like the one my man rides." Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She had to think. "A traveler," she said quickly. "Passed by a few days ago, before the storm. He was headed west. Shared a bit of his fire and was on his way. A short, balding man. A prospector, I think." She was adding details, coloring in the lie, making it real. She could feel Silas's tension behind her, a palpable force. The bounty hunter stared at her for a long, agonizing moment, his little eyes trying to pierce through her story. He seemed to be weighing the likelihood of a hardened outlaw holding up with a lone, pregnant woman against the simpler story of a chance encounter. Her obvious vulnerability was her greatest defense. Finally, with a disgusted snort, he seemed to decide she wasn't worth the trouble. "West, you say?" "Toward the mountains," she confirmed, her voice barely a whisper. He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the snow near her feet. "If you see him, there's $500 on his head. You send word to the sheriff in redemption." He gave her one last, contemptuous look, then turned his horse and rode away, disappearing back over the ridge. Alara sagged against the doorframe, her legs threatening to give out. Silas was there in an instant, his hand on her arm, steadying her. He pulled her back inside and shut the door, plunging the room back into dimness. He stared at her, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. "You lied for me. He would have killed you," she said, her voice trembling now that the danger had passed. "He could have killed you," he countered, his voice low and intense. "You patched my roof," she said, as if that explained everything. He reached out, his rough fingers gently touching her cheek. It was the first time he had touched her with anything other than brusque necessity. The gesture was tentative, questioning. In that moment, the roles had irrevocably shifted. She was no longer just the victim he was protecting out of a sense of duty. She had become his protector, too. She had chosen his life over her own safety. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a fragile, fading woman, but a bastion of courage. And he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he was no longer just hiding in her shack. He was home, The bounty hunter's visit left a permanent mark on their fragile peace. The world outside was no longer a distant abstraction. It was a tangible threat with a name and a price. Silas became more watchful, his gaze often drifting to the ridge where Cain had appeared. The isolation of the shack, once a shared prison, now felt more like a fortress, and they were its sole defenders. Their interdependence deepened into a fierce, unspoken alliance. The pregnancy was advancing, and Alara's body was a landscape of constant change. Her back ached, her feet swelled, and the child within her was a constant, restless presence. One evening, a crippling pain shot through her, so intense it stole her breath. She cried out, clutching her belly as she doubled over. Silas was at her side in an instant, his face a mask of alarm. "What is it? Is it the baby?" "I don't know," she gasped, sweat beading on her forehead. "It's too soon." The pain subsided into a dull, throbbing ache, but the fear remained. He helped her to the cot, his movements surprisingly gentle. He sat beside her, a helpless, worried look on his face. He was a man who knew how to handle a rifle, track a deer, and read the sky, but this was a wilderness he had never navigated. "Tell me what to do," he said, his voice raw with concern. "Just water," she whispered. He brought it to her, holding the cup to her lips. He stayed by her side through the night, bathing her face with a cool cloth when she grew warm, his presence a steady, comforting weight in the darkness. The sharp pains didn't return, but a new, heavy reality settled over them. The baby was coming, and it would not wait for a convenient time. It would not wait for the threat of Jedediah Cain to pass or for the snow to melt. This shared scare stripped away the last of their reservations. His concern wasn't for an abstract duty anymore. It was for her, for Alara, and for the child she carried. He began to talk more, filling the long evenings with stories of his life before he was an outlaw, of the horse he'd raised from a colt, of the way Mary used to hum when she gardened. He was giving her his past, piece by piece. In return, she told him of her girlhood in Ohio, of the scent of rain on the rich black earth, of her dreams of being a teacher. She confessed her deep-seated fear that she would be a failure as a mother, just as she had failed as a homesteader. "You ain't failed," he told her one night, his voice firm as he stared into the fire. "You're still here. That ain't failure. That's fighting." His words were a balm. He saw strength in her where she saw only weakness. He was reviving not just her body with the food he provided, but her spirit with the belief he showed in her. A strange and tender feeling began to bloom in her heart, a feeling she had long thought dead. It wasn't the dizzying, word-spun infatuation she'd had for Thomas. This was quieter, deeper. It was a feeling rooted in shared firewood, patched roofs, and a lie told to a bounty hunter. It was a love born of survival. One afternoon, Silas was outside splitting logs when he suddenly froze, his axe held mid-swing. He tilted his head, listening. Alara, watching from the doorway, felt her own body go rigid. She heard it too, a faint, rhythmic sound, distant but drawing nearer. It was the sound of multiple horses. Not one rider, but several. Silas moved with fluid speed, grabbing his axe and gesturing her back inside. "It's the posse," he said, his voice grim. Cain must have doubled back. He barred the door, then went to the small window, peering out from the edge. "4 of them," he reported, his voice low. "They're spreading out, circling the shack." This was it, the end of their borrowed time. Alara's hand went to her belly. The baby was quiet, as if sensing the danger. "Silas," she began, her voice trembling. "They won't take me alive," he said, checking the load in his rifle. His face was set in hard lines, the face of the outlaw he was. "But I won't let them harm you. Stay on the floor, away from the door." "No," she said, her voice ringing with a sudden, fierce clarity that surprised them both. She walked over to him, placing her hand on his arm, over the worn fabric of his sleeve. "No more fighting." He looked at her, his stormy eyes filled with confusion. "Alara, they mean to hang me. And a gunfight will get us all killed," she insisted. "There has to be another way." Just then, a sharp, undeniable pain seized her, far more powerful than the one before. It radiated from her back all the way around to her belly, a relentless, crushing wave. She cried out, her knees buckling. Silas caught her, his rifle clattering to the floor. "Alara, the baby," she gasped, clinging to him. It's coming. Now. Panic and desperation warred on his face. Outside, a voice boomed. Silas Kane, we know you're in there. This is Sheriff Brody. Come out with your hands empty. He was trapped. The law outside, and a life fighting to be born inside. He looked from Alara's pain-contorted face to the barred door. He could make a run for it, try to shoot his way out. He was fast, and he was a good shot. He might even make it, but it would mean leaving her to face the posse, to give birth alone on the dirt floor. He looked into her eyes, saw the terror and the trust there. He thought of his dead wife, of the life he'd failed to save. He would not fail again. His choice was made in a heartbeat. It wasn't a choice at all. He lowered her gently onto the cot, pulling the blankets around her. It's all right, he said, his voice suddenly calm, a rock in the storm of her pain. I'm not going anywhere. He looked toward the door, his jaw set. He was no longer Silas Kane, the outlaw. He was Alara's anchor. He was the man who was staying. Sheriff, he yelled, his voice clear and strong. There's a woman in here. She's in labor. We need help. A stunned silence fell outside. The posse had expected a gunfight, defiance, a bloody end. They had not expected this. Another contraction tore through Alara, and she screamed, the sound raw and animalistic. It was a sound of pure, primal struggle, a sound no man could mistake. Inside the shack, the world had shrunk to the cot and the fire. Silas was a man possessed. All his focus narrowed onto Alara. He stoked the fire until it blazed, put the last of their water on to boil, and tore the swaddling clothes she'd made into clean strips. He moved with a purpose that defied the terror of the situation. Breathe, he commanded her, his voice a low rumble beside her ear as another wave of pain hit. He took her hand, his grip firm and steady. Breathe with me, she squeezed his hand, drawing on his strength, her knuckles white. Outside, Sheriff Brody was in a dilemma. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man with a wife and 4 children. He had heard that scream. Kane, are you armed? He yelled. My rifle's on the floor. Silas shouted back, his attention never leaving Alara. I'm not a threat to you. But she's fading, Sheriff. She needs a doctor. The nearest doctor is 2 days' ride, and that's if the pass is clear, Brody hollered. You're on your own, Kane. Another scream from Alara, weaker this time. Her strength was failing. Silas's heart clenched. He looked at her pale, sweat-slicked face, her eyes wide with fear. This was it. The fading she had been fighting for months was coming to a head. You're not leaving me, he said, his voice fierce, willing his own life force into her. You hear me, Alara? You are not leaving. You fought too hard. He pressed a wet cloth to her forehead. Talk to me, he urged. Tell me about Ohio. Tell me about the rain. Through gritted teeth, between the crushing waves of pain, she began to talk. She spoke of green fields and the smell of lilac, of her father's strong hands and her mother's lullabies. She wasn't just talking to him. She was anchoring herself to a world beyond the pain, a world where life existed without this struggle. And he listened, his presence a constant, unwavering point of focus. Hours passed. The sun began to set, casting long, bloody streaks across the snow. The posse remained outside, their horses stamping impatiently, the men murmuring amongst themselves. They were witnesses to a drama far more intense than any gunfight. Alara was weakening, her voice fading to a whisper. The time between contractions was growing longer, a dangerous sign. I can't, she sobbed, her body trembling with exhaustion. Silas, I can't. Yes, you can, he insisted, his face close to hers. You are the strongest woman I have ever known. You lied to a bounty hunter for me. You can do this, he leaned in, his lips brushing her temple. Do it for him. For the baby. That sparked something in her. A final, desperate reserve of strength. She gathered herself, her breath coming in ragged pants. One more, she whispered. Help me. He helped her sit up, supporting her back with his own body. He was her strength, her will. Now, Alara, he urged. Push. With a final, gut-wrenching cry that seemed to tear from her very soul, she bore down. The shack was filled with the sound of her effort, the scent of sweat and fear and life. And then, a new sound, thin and reedy, cut through the tension. A baby's cry. It was the most beautiful sound Silas had ever heard. Relief, so profound it was painful, washed over him. He carefully took the small, slippery infant, wrapped it in a piece of the clean cloth, and laid it on Alara's chest. It was a boy, small and perfect. Alara was sobbing, tears of exhaustion and joy streaming down her face. She touched the baby's cheek with a trembling finger. "We did it," she whispered, looking at Silas, her eyes shining with a love so pure and powerful it took his breath away. He was still supporting her, his arms wrapped around her, their faces inches apart. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was not about passion but about survival, gratitude, and a promise. It was the culmination of everything they had endured together. The sound of the door being unbarred made them both jump. Sheriff Brody stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his face etched with awe and exhaustion. He looked at the scene before him, the outlaw holding the new mother, the baby crying softly on her chest, the discarded rifle on the floor. He saw not a criminal and his hostage, but a family. His eyes met Silas's. There was a long, silent understanding that passed between them. Brody's gaze fell on the baby, then back to Silas. "Silas Kane died in this shack today," the sheriff said, his voice quiet but firm. "He tried to shoot his way out. We had no choice." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the other men of the posse who had gathered behind him, their faces humbled. "What we found in here was a homesteader and his wife, and their new baby boy." He turned without another word and walked away. The other men followed, their retreat quiet and respectful. They mounted their horses and rode off, leaving the shack and its new occupants in the profound silence of the twilight. The world, which had shrunk to the four walls of the shack, now feels infinite. The fire crackles in the hearth, a warm and steady heartbeat. Silas holds the baby, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he rocks the sleeping infant. He looks down at the tiny, perfect face, a sense of wonder so profound it feels like a physical ache in his chest. He is no longer Silas Kane, the fugitive. The man who was running died when he chose to stay. Alara watches him from the cot. She is weak, but she is not fading. The emptiness inside her has been filled, not just by the child she holds in her heart, but by the fierce, unwavering devotion of the man who saved her. The shack is no longer a prison or a temporary shelter. It is a home, consecrated by struggle and birth. The scent of wood smoke and milk and clean linen is the scent of a new beginning. She sees the way Silas looks at her son, and then at her, his stormy eyes clear and filled with a quiet, powerful light. There are no words, no grand promises of a future with white picket fences. There is only this moment, this truth. He looks at her, a small, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time, and she knows that in saving her, the outlaw has finally saved himself. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.